Okay, so the second half of Chapter 3, Lesson 5 on the outer planets. We have already gone through Jupiter. We'll do a very quick recap. But then we'll be ready for page 107 when we start talking about Saturn. Just a recap, we're talking about the gas giants. Once again, they are ginormous compared to Earth, and they are made up of different types of gases. We have Jupiter, who is named after the Roman god that's in charge of all other gods, goddesses, demigods, and etc., who is also known as Zeus in the Greek counterpart. Jupiter is 5 times further out in its AU from the Sun, where Earth, once again, is 1 AU. So as we begin Saturn, we'll see that things are going further and further out. We talked about how on Jupiter you would only be about a year old. Some of you are not quite a year old, and some of you are exactly 1 year old. And then we talked about the 4 moons in which Galileo Galilei first saw Europa, Io, Callisto, and Ganymede. And they were later named by an astronomer known as Cassini. But we have over 63 moons that we know of to date that are located around Jupiter. Then we finished up talking about space probes. As you can see on that list from NASA, there on the left, there are many different space probes that we have sent out. The Voyager 2 will come up several different times. Once again, it was sent out in about 1978 and continued out throughout 2003 that we know of that will send us information according to that original chart. But our first main one that we sent out in space to not do a flyby, but actually start to orbit Jupiter and continue to study it was the Galileo. And we got information from it from 1995 to 2003, where we most recently sent out the Juno mission, and it arrived in 2016, and we continue to study several of the different moons of Jupiter, but still get information from it today. So that takes us now to Saturn. So once again, take your notes and be prepared to pause if you need to, go back and rewind if you need to, but make sure you have your notes down so you can be successful on your upcoming work. Saturn is our sixth planet from the Sun. We have My Very Educated Mother Just Served. So Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and then Saturn. Saturn using a different picture now because things were getting way too far out. You couldn't tell where the inner planets even were. But now we are almost 10 times further out than Earth itself. What that translates to us in American words is 891 million miles is a distance we cannot even possibly grasp how far that actually is. And since we are so much further out, then we will expect things like the year to be much longer, which it is. So the majority of us, well, majority of you, not me, the majority of you are about a third of a year old, 29.5 years for it to get around the sun one time, right? So I am about 1 2/3 year old. Another 10 years and I'll be a whopping 2 on Saturn. But because it is so much further out, it takes so much longer to get around. And those length of years are just going to compound the further we go out into our next 2 gas giants. But like Jupiter, its day is rather short compared to Earth. It's a ginormous planet, but the gases spin around it so fast it creates a lot of really strong storms. But we basically have 2 1/4 days on Saturn for every one day we have on Earth. So it spins in 10.7 hours. When we talk about surface features, then, after Knowing that Jupiter's storm is the Great Red Spot, NASA got creative when they were locating and seeing this particular storm, so they named it the Great White Spot. The thing about the Great White Spot compared to the Great Red Spot, as we talked with Jupiter, we can see the Great Red Spot every day, and sometimes a few times a day, for over 350 years. The Great White Spot just periodically shows up in the northern hemisphere of Saturn. It's not always there. When it is there, it's there for a few days, but then it may go away for a couple weeks, but then it ends up coming back. We also have many moons on Saturn. At the time that this book was published, they knew that we had at least 61. So the ones that are the most popular are listed there at the bottom of your page. We have Mimas and Enceladus, Tethys, Dion, Rhea, Titan, and Lapidus. The Titan is the largest one of the moons on Saturn. Some scientists hypothesize that Titan is a moon that could actually support life. We don't have any scientific proof behind that, but it's their idea or their concept. So when we look at the idea of who Saturn is, then we know that our head of the Roman gods is Jupiter. Saturn is the father of Jupiter according to the Roman mythology. Okay? Now we're talking about Kronos. If you know your Greek mythology, that stories like the Percy Jackson series, Kronos, you find out about him. Not necessarily the nicest guy in the world, right? But he is holding a sickle, which is that big long stick with the blade on it. He is basically the god of harvest, the god of time. That's why he has the hourglass in his hand. He controls the seasons. Right? When we look at the temperature on Saturn, then we get once again a very cold temperature. And as I said in the last lesson, it's just going to get colder and colder as we go further out into space. We have negative 178 degrees Celsius, but in American language, that's negative 288 degrees Fahrenheit, almost negative 300 degrees. Um, because of its atmosphere being a lot of liquid gases and frozen gases, then it is something that has thick layers of storms that we can't break through. But even if we could, and even if it wasn't a gas planet, there wouldn't be any way for you to be able to stay alive in that cold of a region. Now, as I said, we would talk about the rings of Saturn and its unique names. Once again, rings are made up of rock and ice chunks in all sorts of different sizes. They are the only rings that can be seen from Earth with the aid of a telescope. The other three gas giants have very faint rings, and we didn't even know they existed until we had space probes that got close to those outer planets. We were able to see them. But NASA decided to name the rings A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Once again, they're quite creative. And they originally, when they first started studying them, they could only see a couple of them. So they believed that there was A and B and C. And then they noticed D was on the inside, but they thought all those outer layers were just one big one. So as they were naming them, they are jumbled up, not in alphabetical order, because they're going in the order in which they were discovered, and they started to see the distinct separation or the faintness or the lightness due to the thickness of the particles that are inside of the rings themselves. Once again, we do have several different missions that we have sent out beyond Saturn to get us some information about it. We go back to the idea of the Cassini mission. So in 1997, which I was teaching my first year here at Granville Wells as a third grade teacher, we had the Cassini space probe that had left Jupiter and arrived to Saturn, and began to take some images and orbit Saturn and give us some information about it. The Voyager 2, which once again was a straight shot mission sent out to get us close to the outer planets as possible. It went by Saturn in 1981. So now when we talk about our planets, then once again we need to remember that we have 5 planets that we can see from space. So now we have discussed all of them that we can see. Our inner planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, that we can see from Earth. Saturn and Jupiter we can see from Earth as well, that are outer planets. So now time passes, right? So as long as people throughout history have been studying the stars and constellations and realized there were planets, they knew about those 5. It's not until a lot of time passes that an astronomer as well as a mathematician known as William Herschel discovered a new planet. So in March of 1781, he had been studying for a couple years, tracking it, doing the math, being able to then calculate where it was going to be the next, you know, few times that he was going to be looking at it out in space. He was able to prove that there was another planet. So we're talking about almost 200 years after Galileo Galilei created the telescope. Right, so we can imagine in that 172 years how the telescope continues to advance and improve its technology, and we can see more and more information and details about space itself. But when he started looking at the uh, genealogy of the Roman gods, he finds out that Saturn doesn't have a father. Right? So we know that according to Roman mythology, Saturn had Jupiter, Neptune, Pluto. Those were his 3 main sons. But there wasn't a Roman father for Saturn himself. So he switches over and he starts to look at Greek. Right? So in the Greek mythology, then we look and we find spelled 3 different ways, but we have the name of Kronos. So Saturn's father is actually Kronos or Uranus, originally spelled Ooranus for Uranus. But this is our first truly Greek god instead of a Roman god. And he is the father, not the most nice guy in the entire world, right? But he is who he is. But he is just simply known as the Greek god of the skies. He's also the father that brought the Titans, if you know about mythology, into existence by creating them. So Uranus is our 7th planet from the sun. My very educated mother just served us, right? 7th out from the sun in order from the solar system. Notice its rings are going straight up and down instead of sideways like the other planets. And as we got further out, now we're going 19.2 times further out from the sun as Earth. So now, being so much further out from the sun, we have a much longer year or a longer revolution. And contrary to popular belief, no, I am not close to a year old on Uranus. In fact, my parents aren't even a year old on Uranus. 84 years is longer than many people last here on the Earth. When we look at, once again, a giant planet compared to ours when it comes to a day, still spinning faster than the Earth does. So in 17.2 Earth hours, the planet is able to spin around completely a little more than one time. When we look at the atmosphere of Uranus, then we have mostly hydrogen, but we do start seeing some other gases like helium and methane that these gas giants are being made out of. From the flybys that we have done, we know that Uranus has at least 27 moons. The most popular ones then are Titania, Oberon, Umbriel, Ariel, and Miranda. We look at the Titans, those would be individuals known in the Titan universe. Still an extremely cold planet at negative 153 degrees or negative 240 degrees Fahrenheit. Way too cold for us to, once again, be able to survive. And we also notice that it has faint rings, but as I said, its rings are going straight up and down instead of going slanted or horizontal as we expect for most other planets. So once we had a space probe that was able to do a flyby of Uranus and study it for a little bit of time, we noticed how the gases were not swirling around horizontally. They're actually going vertically. And what that tells us is that Uranus's poles are going horizontally, and therefore the planet is rolling like a giant bowling ball going around in its orbit around the sun. All other planets have a vertical. The majority of our information that we get about Uranus comes from space probes. One such space probe is imaged here, known as the Hubble telescope, which is a giant telescope that is solar powered that we have out in space, that every so often we continue to send astronauts and space shuttles out to land and connect to and add on to improve its strength so that we can continue to gather more and more information. We also have space probes that are out there that we have on a trajectory, which means it's traveling. So you'll see the Voyager 2 once again. It was a mission that was sent straight out into space, calculating where it would be able to arrive and get close enough to the different outer planets. Originally sent and gathered information about Jupiter and then Saturn, and then in January of 1986, which would have been my sophomore year, my 10th grade year in high school, we were able to get our first up-close images of Uranus. Now time once again passes. Takes 65 more years before the land telescopes are created strong enough to discover yet another planet. So in September of 1846, Johann Gottfried Galilei, it's not Johann, by the way, it's Johann. So Johann Galilei discovered there was another planet. Once again, he had been studying and doing the math and was able to predict its trajectory and where it was going to end up in its orbit, and was able to prove that there was another planet. So another 65 years from the time that Uranus was discovered. Now, as he was looking at it, he discovered that this eighth planet, my very educated mother just served us 9, that this planet appeared to be blue. So hypothetically speaking, if it's going to be blue, it must be a water planet. So the imagination of he and several other astronauts with how much water was going to be there and what kind of life was going to be there, since it had to be a water planet. Since it had to be a water planet, we shall name him after the Roman god of the oceans or of the sea, and that would be Neptune. His counterpart in Greek, if you know Greek mythology, is Poseidon. When we look at Neptune, then we get 30 times further out from the sun than the Earth. And that leads us to some really long years as we continue going further out into space. So that is 2.8 billion miles. Once again, a distance that we cannot possibly fathom. But it is 30 times further out from the sun. The further we get out, the longer these AUs are going to be, which means our years are going to be much, much longer. It takes 163.8 Earth years for Neptune to go around the sun one time. Not only will you never turn a year old, but according to the average generation in America, there will be 5.5 generations of your entire family that are born and living and then dying before a year happens on Neptune. So your great, 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 great grandchildren would be here on the earth before a year completely happens from the time that you were born. Right? So we have a length of time that you and I cannot fathom also, not just the distance, but our length of time is just not something we can understand. Neptune still continues to spin faster than our Earth does at 1.5 times faster, or 16.1 hours, when once again those are Earth hours, for it to go all the way around. When we had the Voyager 2 go by and do some up-close studies and tests, then we discovered that it is mostly hydrogen, but also, once again, we have helium and methane. However, we discovered that it is indeed, sorry, Johann, not a water planet. NASA noticed with the Voyager 2 that there was a big dark spot located on Neptune that was being tracked throughout the time of the space probe that's out there. It is now able to be seen from the Hubble telescope with the advancements we've made with it. But we had NASA naming it the Great Dark Spot. The Great Red Spot has been there as long as we've known about it. The Great White Spot on Saturn appears and disappears off and on throughout history as time is going along. And the Great Dark Spot, as far as we can tell, it's pretty much there all the time. But we have a couple other storms that are usually there, but they are more like the white spots where they appear and disappear. We have a triangular storm. They do not know why it's in the shape of a triangle instead of an oval, but it goes around much further than the Great Dark Spot does. And so they named it Scooter, where at the southern part of the hemisphere of Neptune, there's a smaller storm that reappears not as often as the Great Dark Spot, but continues to pop up into the outer layers of the gases known as the small dark spot. So once again, as I said, NASA comes up with quite creative names for different items out in space. We know of, as of this time in history, that Neptune has at least 13 moons. Triton is a ginormous moon compared to all of the other moons that we know about in space. We are extremely cold at negative 200 degrees Celsius, not a temperature that we can fathom. That would be negative 392 degrees Fahrenheit for us Americans. And then we also notice later on with the space probes that Neptune also has rings, very faint rings with great distances between them, but 3 that they've been able to track and figure out. But one of the interesting things is that these are the only 2 planets that we know of that their orbits overlap, right? So for a period of time, Neptune is going to be further out than Pluto is going to be. And so instead of having my very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas, we end up with My very educated mother just served us pizzas 9, and that gets rather confusing. But this is not going to happen again in your lifetime, though it did happen in my lifetime. So when I was in about fourth grade in 1979, Neptune and Pluto crossed their paths. Now, they didn't come close to one another because they were in different locations basically in their orbit path. But for about 22 years, in 1999, my first year of teaching sixth grade, Neptune's orbit went back inside the orbit of Pluto. And so, not in your lifetime will that happen again. But it is interesting that those are the only two that we know of in our solar system that they actually switch um, their position basically when they're orbits. So we're looking at the years of 2227 to 2247, according to NASA, before this strange occurrence happens again. No, none of us will be alive. So Voyager 2, once again, we have traveling out into space. My senior year in 1989, we got our very first up close pictures of Neptune, and we got to see what its surface looked like, which is blue with the giant or great dark spot. But it took 12 years for it to get there, which is quite a long flight. All right, so once your notes are done, then the following school day, you will have the entire class to do the assignment or to finish up these notes if you don't get them finished at home.